Hello and welcome to the Supernatural Fandom Track here at Continual. I'm your host, Gail C. Martin, and today is part 2 of talking with the writers of Monstrum, and I'll let them tell you what that is, but it's all about Supernatural, and we're going to have a great time talking about it. Simon, can you start us out with grounding us a little bit on what Monstrum is, please?
Monstrum, it's an online journal, sort of dedicated to the fantastic. It's a really nice journal. I like the fact that it's online, that it's accessible to everybody. One of the things about being an academic is so much of what you write is published in the very expensive Journal of Nobody Reads It Studies. And so one of the great things about Monstrum is it's very eclectic, but it also has a kind of direct line to the people who are really interested in this stuff. And I'm, as the editor of this particular special issue, I think we were very keen that we could gather together some people who were able to respond to the show very, very quickly when it ended, which, as it turned out, it didn't end when we thought it was going to end, and so on and so forth. But it just seemed like the right place to have this kind of discussion and debate about this sort of landmark, legendary TV series, which does not deserve to go gently into the good night, but needs to be kind of talked about and reflected on more and more because of its sort of significance to fantasy television and to television in general, I think.
Okay, wonderful. Well, now that we've level set what Monstrum is, let's get the introductions done. Will.
Hi, my name is Will Dodson. I'm the residential college coordinator, faculty in residence for Ashby College and Strong College at UNC Greensboro, where I teach media studies and literature and rhetoric courses. And what do I confess? I'm a fan of Supernatural.
We might have guessed, but thank you for that. Simon, anything to add to who you are and why you're here?
Yeah, okay. So I'm an associate professor of film and television at Kingston University in Southwest London in the UK. Anybody watching both of these special editions will realize that I'm sitting in the same place that Stacey was in her panel. So yes, we are married, and we watch TV shows together. We watch Supernatural. We watch all kinds of TV shows. We write about them together. So how do I come to this? Just from watching way too much television, fundamentally.
Okay, Huxley?
I'm Huxley. I'm 19, not a large amount of academic qualifications, except that I also enjoy watching television. I'm Will's stepdaughter. We wrote our article in Monstrum together.
Okay, and Lynn?
Hi, I'm Dr. Lynn Zubernis. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist and a professor at Westchester University in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in the States. I'm a huge Supernatural fan. I have written, I think, 7 books on Supernatural, including the last 2 books I wrote with the cast of Supernatural. So that's Family Don't End with Blood. And the most recent one, There'll Be Peace When You Are Done, which is all about the legacy that this great television show leaves behind, which I think is something we all agree on.
And I'm Gail C. Martin and Morgan Bryce. I write epic fantasy, urban fantasy, near future, post-apocalyptic, and more. All my modern worlds are ones Sam and Dean could walk into and feel right at home. And I'm thrilled to have written a chapter in There'll Be Peace When You Are Done. I might be a wee bit obsessed with the show. So let's dive into this, because Monstrum talked about the underpinnings of the show itself, its textual background, which we covered in the first panel, but then also the legacy, the impact on the industry, how it impacted and how it was impacted, some of the things that came before that influenced it, and so much so much to talk about there. So let's start out with, Simon, I was surprised with your essay to find out how hard it is to be a Supernatural fan in the United Kingdom. It kind of sounds like what we got over here in the States with the pre-reboot Doctor Who, where what channel is it on tonight? And are they playing them in order?
Yeah, it's a nightmare. One of the things that I've always been interested in is the broadcast of American shows over here. I mean, I grew up in the late 70s, early 80s watching, the A-Team and TJ Hooker, and I remember in the mid 80s, I think it was, Channel 4 was showing The Gong Show, and it was completely out of context. So I remember sitting there thinking to myself at the age of 13 or 14, why is everybody in America dressed as if it's the mid 1970s? Without realizing that The Gong Show was from the mid 1970s, because nobody ever told us. And then, in the early 90s, getting into the X-Files, which was broadcast in this very higgledy-piggledy kind of way. It was on BBC One, and then it was on BBC Two, and then it moved to BBC One in its second season, and then they broadcast the second season out of order. And since then, I've just been following up. And obviously, when Supernatural started, we didn't start, Stacey and I didn't start watching it at first. We were recommended it by a friend who bought us the DVD box set of the first half of season 1. This is back in the days when they would release them in 2 halves. And then we started watching it, and it was that thing that it would jump around. It had a stable home for a few years on free-to-air television. Then it went to cable TV, which you had to pay for. You had to have a subscription. Then it went to a different cable TV service that you had to have a different subscription for, which was Sky Living. And then Sky Living dropped it and nobody picked it up. So I think it was the end of season 8 in 2014. Supernatural wasn't on in the UK at all for the entirety of that year. Nobody picked up season 9 at all. So for a whole year, we couldn't watch it. And then it was picked up back on free to air for a couple of years. Then it disappeared again. And the last season actually was airing on a channel called 4 Music, which I've never even heard of at all. And it's some kind of sort of subgroup of Channel 4, some kind of music channel. And it was on at 1 in the morning. It was being broadcast after repeats of a show called Naked Attraction, which was a naked dating show, which I didn't watch, I hasten to add. I almost watched it for research, but then I decided against it. And yeah, it's one of the things that fascinates me about Supernatural. It's the last bastion of that old-fashioned way of watching shows, American shows in the UK, where they would be all over the place. They'd run somewhere between 6 months to a year late. Now, The Walking Dead is simulcast. Dexter, which started last week, was simulcast. So it was on at 9 o'clock on a Sunday night in the States and 2 o'clock in the morning here. So if you wanted to, you could stay up and watch it. And Supernatural is this kind of holdover from the 1990s and early 2000s. And that's why I kind of was interested in charting just that process and just how damn difficult it was.
I think that's interesting, because certainly it impacts how fans can interact with the show. And we see some of that here on whether or not you got into the show when it was coming out episode by episode, week by week, with the hiatus in between, or whether, like me, you fell into it halfway through season 11, binge watched 11 seasons in 4 months, and were caught up by the beginning of season 12. How do you think the way fans are able to interface with the show and consume it, does that have an effect on the fandom and how fans relate to the show? Does that make a difference? And that's an open question to anybody.
I think, sorry, go on.
No, after you.
I was just going to say, I think it does, because obviously, certainly in the last kind of maybe 5 or 6 years, I'm not sure, but the fandom is global. the internet, it's all happening everywhere simultaneously. So if you're a fan of this show and you're watching it at sometimes it's 6 months behind, sometimes it's as far as 18 months behind. Yeah, you have to be careful how you engage with the fandom, because you're going to find out things that you don't want to know, and which you may not find out for another year and a half. So I think it does have an impact in terms of kind of creating a global community. But of course, bear in mind, I'm only talking about the UK here. I mean, the global is way beyond that, and I haven't even started to look into that. But I think it does. And there were campaigns. They tried. There was a movement to try and get Carry On My Wayward Son to #1, just to kind of raise awareness that the show wasn't on. And there's nobody you could go talk to. So on the one hand, it's divisive, but on the other hand, it allows for the UK fan community to come together as a close-knit group, because we've got something to fight for, someone to fight against, which are the people who aren't showing it.
Okay. Will, you were going to say something.
Well, sure. I guess I can speak to our particular situation, and Huxley can chime in. Because this was something that we, and speaking of American fandom, because this is something that we did together as appointment viewing, and our schedules were such that we could never catch a broadcast or anything like that. We were on the schedule of a certain streaming service that carries the show. Are we allowed to say the name of the streaming service? Okay.
Yeah.
It's Netflix. So we were always at least a season behind the broadcast schedule. And because we made a rule never to watch an episode without the other person, sometimes we'd even get farther behind than that. So we had to very studiously avoid certain areas of the internet, avoid conversation. I remember Huxley, weren't you saying there was a conversation going on at school one day that you had to avoid?
Yeah, it was, I was in middle school at the time. And yeah, a bunch of people were talking about the new episodes, and I was like, oh, and we were in class too, so I couldn't leave. So I was just like, I have to tune it out, can't listen, figure something else out.
Yeah, so depending on people's individual engagements with the show, you really have to pick your spots as far as engaging with other fans.
Well, it's interesting because Supernatural kept that traditional weekly drop of an episode all the way through, when we're seeing shows now put an entire season out there so you can binge watch it. And that certainly wasn't an option early on. Lynn, you've talked about living through the hiatus or hellatus, as people refer to it.
Yeah, it's interesting because my experience with this show was the traditional experience. I started watching it in season 1, and I watched it all the way through season 15. And honestly, I only missed a handful of episodes airing live. There was a time when I would arrange my teaching schedule around whatever night Supernatural was airing on, so that one particular night I knew I could be home, because I felt like I had started it, invested 10, 12, 13 years into watching it live. I really wanted to continue to watch the entire series live. And it really creates, I think in some ways binge watching creates an intense emotional investment, because you are seeing it all at once and there's an intensity to that. But watching it on a weekly basis with the gaps that exist, and in the beginning for the first 3 or 4 seasons, the show being constantly on the verge of cancellation and not knowing whether it was actually going to come back at all, created another kind of really intense emotional investment. So I'm still friends with a lot of people who began watching it in season 1 and stuck with it all the way through. And after 15, now 16 years of that emotional investment, there are a number of us who feel really, really strongly about the show at this point. But I do think it makes a difference. I also think it makes a difference that a lot of people picked up the show when it began streaming. So they caught it in the middle and then went backwards to catch up. And a lot of people also discovered the show not through the show itself, but through social media. So fans who discovered the show on Tumblr or through fan fiction or fan art or whatever, some of those fans came in with a very different understanding of the show than people who started watching it in the beginning. And I know I wrote in my chapter article in Monstrum about some of the divisions that this helped to create in the fandom, because some people came into it watching it for a really different reason, maybe one that had nothing to do with the Winchesters, with the brothers. Whereas people who started watching in the beginning had 3 seasons of it being just about the brothers. And those factions have remained to this day. And I think that's really had an impact on the fandom at large.
Since in this section we're talking about the show's not only its legacy, but also its interaction with the TV landscape and the industry, have we now taught viewers to binge watch? Are people losing the interest or ability to follow a serial TV show? I know we debate that a lot in publishing with the idea of rapid release, where you put out 6 books within 6 months, versus the traditional, no, you're just going to have to wait a year for the next one. And it's really interesting to see how people who came up with that accept it, and who didn't come up with it go, no, I'm not waiting. What do you think? Was Supernatural kind of the last of its type with that?
I mean, I don't think it necessarily was the last of its type, but I do think it's harder these days. It's interesting. I had a conversation with Eric Kripke, who was the showrunner and the creator of Supernatural, but is also the showrunner on The Boys, which is another show that I love. And he really had to fight he didn't want The Boys to come out all at once. He wanted it to come out with more like the serial, weekly kind of model, and his reasoning, if I'm recalling it correctly, was in some ways it promotes a higher level of engagement with the show, because fans have a week or 2 weeks or whatever to really kind of go deep into it and watch it a number of times and then ponder about things and hypothesize about things. So I think it sometimes tends to create a more engaged fandom, because there is that pause between when you're waiting for the next episode to come out. That said, if I recall correctly, Amazon did not want to do it that way. And there were certainly a lot of people who were not used to that and who protested that and were like, what do you mean I have to wait 2 more weeks for your next episode to come out?
I think
Anybody else?
Sorry.
Go ahead.
No, I think it's kind of interesting in the UK, because we still have our kind of core sort of terrestrial channels, the official channels, BBC One, BBC Two, ITV, etc. And their drama series, which tend to be very short, are usually predicated on the idea of 1 episode per week. So I think here we're still used to the idea, and there's a kind of an element of prestige to it. If it's quote unquote, good drama, the kind of drama that you're supposed to, that they want to promote, then it tends to be 1 episode per week. But usually it's like 6 or 7 episodes. I think where Supernatural is kind of representing the end of something, certainly with relation to fantasy TV or horror TV or whatever you want to, however you want to kind of call it, is that sort of the big kind of 22 episode spring, fall to spring kind of season. I don't think we're going to see that very much anymore in the kind of fantasy arena per se. But I think that there is a difference between the two. I mean, we watch Supernatural every week. And years ago, Stacey was editing a book about Supernatural called An Unofficial Roadmap of Supernatural. And we had to rewatch the first 5 seasons, which we kind of binge watch in a very short space of time. And I must admit, I kind of got fed up with it. I didn't like watching it that way. It was much better that it was Sunday night, sit down, cup of tea, watch Supernatural. And it's a show that kind of worked that way for me. It gave it that sort of appointment to view, that specialness. I
think one of the things you do notice when you binge it are some of the repetitive things. My husband started a very annoying bingo card on how many times Sam got thrown across the room, because we'd binge watch it. There he goes again. And you don't maybe notice that so much if you're not watching them back to back. Will and Huxley, what do you think?
Yeah, we were just thinking about that. I think there's a generational thing, right? Like I was going to break in and say, the problem with today is the very term binge watching tells you that it's bad for you. And certainly in our case, we tend to watch, maybe since we were watching them with seasons dropped all at once, we would watch one episode a night maybe and alternate with other shows. On the occasions that we'd watch 2 or 3 in a row, as someone said, we get a little kind of fed up with it because you pick up the kind of repetitive elements and things like that that are kind of a part of episodic TV's DNA. Especially when a mythology episode ends on a cliffhanger, and then suddenly there's a one-off Monster of the Week episode, and you're like, wait, what's going on? Whereas if you space them out, your patience, I think, is a little bit better. Of course, my youngest daughter said to me just the other day, I was watching something on live television, and she says, "What's this on?" And I said, "This is regular TV." And she goes, "Is that the thing that makes you watch commercials from the 70s?" And that's what she thinks about it. So Huxley, I think you might be able to speak to the generational difference, because I grew up watching, like the other panels, I grew up watching episodic TV on that thing that makes you watch commercials. But you're the first generation, I think, that is totally Netflixed.
Yeah, we are certainly a generation of the internet. I think I've seen many people just online engaging with film and television, being like, okay, these things are being released like weekly, but I'm not going to watch them weekly. I'm going to wait until they're uploaded the full season, and then I will binge watch the whole season. I think, just the way, I don't think that there's the same level of patience to wait the weeks. And I think I know other people were talking about picking up patterns and stuff, but I think it's just so ingrained in how we watch television now that's like how it's supposed to be for us. It's not supposed to be this waiting. You watch it and then watch the next episode until you can't watch it anymore.
Which I think is interesting, because the way the industry measures the popularity of a show is episode by episode. So, and we had this discussion in publishing as well. If readers say, interesting series you're writing, they're going to be 6 books, I'm going to wait until all 6 are out to buy them. The 6th book may never come out because the series may get dropped because it hasn't had enough sales. I'm thinking that since we are still kind of trapped in the 50s with the Nielsen's and some of the measurements, if people say, great show, I'm going to wait till it comes out on Netflix or on DVD, and they don't watch it as it unfolds, it may never get there. What do you think? How much of a danger do you think that is? Anyone? Will, you're muted.
Yeah, I don't know. I was trying to think back to how many shows are still released week to week. I know Huxley really likes Rhino Burp, and that was coming out on Sci-Fi each week, and we would TiVo it for whatever the recording device is. And the CW Arrowverse shows still come out week to week, but then get logged into things like Hulu or other apps that you can stream them from. And there's
the CW has its own app that you can grab the latest episode.
Right.
The next.
There's so much streaming right now that this is something that I've been discussing with other people. The question of whether physical media releases for television and for a lot of streaming content, especially that's branded specifically to the platform, like Netflix original movies and so on. What the possible futures are, right? Because the problem with streaming is that if it disappears, it's gone. You know, whereas with physical media, you can preserve it and at least show it in the classroom. And I don't know, you know, I'm kind of annoyed at some of the streaming films that I'm not able to get physical releases of. As far as the viability of shows, though, that goes back to your original question. You know, TV still uses the old Nielsen ratings, but the streaming apps don't share their results, right? We don't know how well shows are doing on Netflix or on Prime, because these are private companies that opt out of announcing those numbers. So I don't know how any of us can know what the impact is going to be as far as releases go and shows continuing and so on. Of course, you think that. Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to. It reminded me, you know, harkens back to the example of Family Guy, right, which is a show that got canceled and then resurrected through the sales of physical DVDs, and so you wonder, you know, is that possible for shows that end on, you know, regular TV and then get picked up on streaming networks? I wonder if that'll happen.
I was just going to say, I am far from an expert at this at all, but I do follow Supernatural and everything that happens with Supernatural very closely. And there is someone more savvy than I am who tracks every week where Supernatural is in terms of viewing and is still doing it. And it includes a number of streaming platforms. So I do think the metric has moved away from just Nielsen's. It's not that limited anymore, but I doubt if it encompasses anything. I mean, Supernatural significantly, unbelievably, is still like in the top 10 of streamed content, and it's a whole full year after it ended. So I think that's pretty amazing. That's why I follow this. The other thing I was going to say, Will, that you reminded me of when you were speaking, is that I just read an article, I can't remember where it was, but it was advising people to, if they can, to try to get physical copies of their favorite media, because it is projected to be really difficult to continue to have access to the things that we now just stream, and they're sort of ephemeral and then they're gone. So I feel vindicated in my old schoolness that I still try to get physical copies of media, because it does seem to be recommended now by a lot of people.
So, Will and Huxley, your essay was on the supernatural blended family. And of course, Lynn wrote about fandom as well. And Simon, a lot of your concerns with the accessibility in the UK had to do with how do you engage with the fandom if you're all at different places. So what did you mean by blended family?
When I was 7, my parents got divorced, and then when I was around 8 or 9, my mom met Will, and they got married, and now we have a blended family in that way, where I have a step parent and now a younger, technically half sister, but I just call her my sister. Half sister sounds so mean. So yeah, just not your, typical nuclear family situation.
Which certainly Sam and Dean didn't have the typical nuclear family situation either.
No.
Right. That's how my wife, Huxley's mother, Sky, actually introduced us to the show. In fact, as of this taping, I believe she is currently on her 5th complete viewing of the series right now. At least she was watching an episode this morning. I don't know. Anyway, she introduced us to it, and Huxley was 10 at the time. So I guess there were about 6 or 7 seasons available on Netflix. So we watched the first episode together, just the 2 of us. And that was one of the first things that we had ever done, just the 2 of us. She's the oldest of our 3 daughters. And so our fandom of the show developed as the show became a bonding experience for us, but also because the show is so much about family, we began thinking about the nature of our blended and extended family. At the end of my biographical note in the essay, I write that everything I learned about fatherhood, I learned from Bobby Singer, which is true. I can be very gruff, but also tender and loving, I think. Anyway, so in terms of how we engaged with the wider fandom, it became a very, as it is, I'm sure for every fan, a very personal experience, the way we would kind of bond over the show, talk about the mythology and lore of the monsters, the brotherly bond between Sam and Dean, and the sisterly bond that Huxley has with her siblings, and so on. And so then as Huxley grew and got older, you know, now we've been watching it together for 9 years, the nature of those conversations, those fandom conversations, changed. And we're still pissed about the Wayward Sisters spinoff not getting picked up.
Well, certainly rule number one is don't leave your stepbrother in hell for 10 years.
Yeah.
Lynn and Simon, I'm fascinated on this idea of how someone's access point to the series can change their trajectory and their relationship to fandom. Please talk about that, because I think that's something that happens to all of us sooner or later that we don't really think about. You know, did we watch the show live? Did we only see it binge? Did we get it on DVD? Did we see it out of order at the gym? You know, you don't really think about how that impacts where you go in the fandom and your role, but yeah, I can see where it would.
I think it's not even just sort of how you access the show or how you watch it. It's also because fandom is now split amongst many platforms, and each of the platforms have very different norms and values and rules of engagement and preferences. So when I discovered Supernatural way back in season 1, there really was only one platform where Supernatural fandom was happening. That seems crazy to say now because it's only 16 years later, but there was really just LiveJournal. You know, it was this little, very personal blogging platform that was mostly journal entries, and then people developed communities on LiveJournal. But it was a very segregated environment. It felt like we used to call it the safe space, because it was very outside of mainstream culture. And we sort of felt like we could interact on that platform without really anybody else interfering or even seeing what we were talking about. So it was a very freeing experience to be on LiveJournal in those early days. But it was also a relatively homogeneous fandom. Everybody had come in at the same time. Everybody was interacting on the same platform, following the same rules. That is vastly different now and has been vastly different for almost a decade. So depending on whether your primary fandom platform is Tumblr or Twitter or Reddit or Instagram or TikTok or, you know, or LiveJournal, if it still exists, depending on that, you have a very different feel for not only what the fandom is about and how the norms are for interaction, but even what the show is about. Tumblr fandom watches, in some sense, a different show than LiveJournal fandom did, or that Twitter fandom does. And there's been a lot of academic writing recently about how much more fraught that has made fandom, because these different platforms inspire a different way of interaction and often reward fans for interacting in a very adversarial way, which was certainly not the norm back in the day. And as a result, I think that has really fractured the Supernatural fandom even more. So I think the platforms are another thing that has had a really big impact. Unfortunately, I feel like a lot of times kind of a negative impact, just because it's so hard to integrate and feel like a community, just one single community across all these disparate platforms.
It's kind of a random version of back in the day when there were 3 broadcast channels and you got your news from one of the 3 broadcast channels. So everybody pretty much heard the same news. And now you can pick what news you want to hear and how you want it presented to you and what wrapped in whatever worldview you want. And so we're no longer experiencing the same reality in the same way. We can't all agree, yes, this thing happened. And that's kind of a microcosm of what seems to be going on in the supernatural fandom as well, because their reality is real, but there's no shared reality now. Definitely makes conversation difficult. Simon, anything from the UK side of things?
Yeah. I mean, I'm not on social media, so I've no idea what different platforms everything's happening. But just listening to everybody talking and sort of cycling back to earlier questions and thinking about what Will and Huxley were saying, I think one of the interesting things that the new culture, the binge watch culture, kind of is problematizing is this idea, in a way, it is the idea of a shared community. See, you know, I think back to sort of the early 1990s, and I think back to Who Killed Laura Palmer on Twin Peaks, and everybody sat down and watched that, or everyone who was interested in it, and then you know, wherever I was at university at the time, you know, we then got together and went next day and went, oh my God, look what happened. And the same with the X-Files, particularly in some of those kind of key sort of mythology moments, you know, you would sit down and watch it. More recently in this country, we had things like Broadchurch with David Tennant, and it was Who Killed whatever his name was. And every Monday, that's what people were talking about. But if you're watching it on streaming, or you're, you know, how can you build a community if everybody watches the show in an afternoon and the next day watches something else? You end up with this kind of micro community of everybody kind of tweeting, oh my God, Midnight Mass is so good. And then the next day they've all moved on because you've watched it and it's over. And so I think, you know, the idea of watching 15 years of a television series together, whether you do it as a kind of father-daughter kind of bonding thing, or, you know, as Stacey and I did, you build, you know, you don't have to be part of a big community to still have a community of people who are watching it. It can be a community of 2, or it can be a community of 5 people. It doesn't make any a huge amount of difference. But if you watch everything in an afternoon, that kind of goes away. And that's, you know, partly because of that, partly because I'm old. I like the kind of broadcast version of it. That's what I grew up with. And yeah, I would rather watch something on broadcast than buy the DVD and then, you know, rewatch it at my leisure. Although, having said that, just to finalize this point, Stacey and I are in the middle of watching Gilmore Girls for the first time on Netflix. So we've seen, you know, Baby Sam, which is really quite funny. And it's interesting talking to other people about it who haven't watched it for 10 years, whenever it finished. And so I'm chatting to an adult about this show that I'm watching, and they watched it as a teenager. And they're talking to me about their experience of watching it when they were, you know, kind of 16, and they're now 28. It's a really interesting experience to kind of debate a show in that kind of way. It's kind of fun.
Well, and you know, before Laura Palmer, there was Who Shot J.R. Ewing, and that was the cliffhanger. Even people who didn't watch Dallas talked about it the next day at work. That was the water cooler conversation. It made headlines, and that only works when you don't have an episode following immediately after, because the boost to ratings then to watch the next episode when the new season came out was huge, which was, of course, the point.
I'd like to build. Oh, sorry.
Oh, go ahead. No, go ahead.
Well, I want to build on that point a little bit, because you got to, you know, the money-making model has changed in ways, right? Binge watching makes television in particular, but film as well, narrative film as well, more disposable, right? Because you consume it and move on. And I think that's one of the reasons you're seeing deals like the one Netflix has with Criterion now, where some of their branded movies get released on physical medias to kind of extend the life. But the other thing, and this goes to that generational perspective that Simon was talking about. When you have a long running show like this, you stretch out the viewing process over weekly and when the seasons are released, you feel the characters age, and you age with the characters. I feel that rather poignantly because of our individual situation, with Huxley growing from a kid of 10 to whatever she is now at 19, a young adult, and kind of realizing implicitly that our experience of the show was changing as we watched it over the years, which would have been even more pronounced had we watched it totally on broadcast, rather than kind of artificially following the broadcast schedule as we did. I don't know if Huxley felt that as well, as she was kind of going through the hell of adolescence.
I mean, yeah. Obviously, your brain changes a lot from 10 to 18. I guess I was when it ended. So yeah, I think it definitely did change how we viewed it and talked about it and engaged with each other. And like Simon was saying, that was a smaller community of two, but then also, I think just, again, child of the internet, it's where a lot of fandom that I engage with takes place, not just for Supernatural, but for everything. And I think it's interesting to see how people share stuff about it, where it's not usually so much conversations like, oh, what do you think is gonna happen? Who do you think did this? It's more sharing of fan art or fan fiction, and it's just sharing things that you create for it. And it's the engagement there that I think really cements fandom now, instead of those more like interpersonal conversations in a way.
I think one of the go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say, Huxley, yes, I so agree. And that's another big part of the difference between segments of fandom, because that is what, like, if you go to Tumblr, fandom is very much based around fanon, not canon. Whereas old school fandom is very much based around canon. And sometimes those things don't mix very well, because they're both valid. They're both absolutely valid ways of consuming media, but they're very different, and they emphasize different things, and they interpret the actual material very differently. And sometimes when those communities, which function really well on their own, within the community, intra-community, that functions really well and as a bonding agent in the community. But when you try to mesh those communities in like a shared space like Twitter, for example, which pulls from all the surrounding platforms, it doesn't always mesh so well, because people are really talking about different things. So yeah, you make a really good point.
I think one of the other things, especially when you have a long-running show that isn't a period piece, like Gunsmoke ran for 20 years, but it was already set in the past. Supernatural was set in kind of a separate present. And so when you go back and you watch something that aired in 2005 and was in the moment of 2005, there are many ways we've changed in 2021. The 2021 viewer is not the 2005 viewer. And so sometimes we hear a lot of cross discussion in fandom about what should or shouldn't have happened 15 years ago. Well, that's really hard, because if you experienced it in 2005, you were in 2005. That was the world. And it's kind of different to come back and start now and go, oh, I can't believe they did that. Different time, we're different. Any thoughts on that?
I'll just jump in here and say, I think one of the things I thought was really clever about the show was the kind of anchoring of parts of it, its ethos, if you like, in the 1970s. So you've got the Impala, which is a late 60s car, but you know, that sort of muscle car thing bleeds over into the 70s. The music is all from the 70s. What I find about the show, rewatching old episodes now, I mean, you know, there's some issues with sort of gender politics and things like that, which you may have touched on in the last panel, but it's only the phones that look weird. You know, the music was old in 2005. The car was old in 2005. The clothes in a way were old in 2005. It would be worse if they were, you know, sitting in the Impala listening to Take That or something, or Justin Bieber. That would date it a lot more and probably change the nature of the show somewhat. But I think it was very clever to kind of anchor it in the past anyway. It does create a kind of pseudo timelessness to it, which I think offsets. I mean, I agree what you're saying, but it's offset a little bit by that.
Mm-hmm. Lynn, any thoughts?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I don't even think that was really a conscious decision on Kripke's part. From conversations I've had with him, I've never heard him say that that was part of his reasoning, but it did work incredibly well. I'm in the midst of doing a full series rewatch now with a bunch of friends. So we started with the pilot and we're slowly working our way through. So we're in the middle of season 2 now. And we were watching the episode Croatoan, and I was so struck by the fact that their flip phones don't have service very often, because back in the day, your cell phone didn't have service a lot of the time, which doesn't really happen anymore. But then they went from that to, oh, here's a payphone. Let's see if the payphone is working. So, I mean, in some ways, I've forgotten how long ago 2006 was, but I do agree that, you know, watching it that way, it doesn't seem jarring, because the entire show seems a little bit timeless or a little bit out of time. So I think that ended up being something that is really helping its longevity and is going to continue to help its longevity, even if it was unintentional.
Well, folks, we have blown through our time, as we often do, and I'm sure we could talk for the whole rest of the afternoon, but let's go around again and have everybody mention where people can find you online, or find your Monstrum work online, or books or whatever. Will.
Yeah, thanks. I've got a couple essays in the Monstrum journal online. So anybody who'd like to search through that journal, there's so much great scholarship in there that's accessible. So I highly recommend people spend some time rooting around there. I'll also hawk my book, American Twilight, The Cinema of Tobe Hooper, co-edited with Chris Woofter. That's available on appropriately, the University of Texas Press. Other than that, I have no online presence whatsoever. So the work is all you can find, I'm afraid.
Okay, Simon.
Well, first off, I want to hawk Will's book, because I have a copy of it and it's great. So it's a really, really great book. Now, sadly, no, I'm not on. I don't have an online presence either. But the last couple of books I did, I've spent a long time writing about Stephen King. So also from the University of Texas Press is Screening Stephen King, which is a kind of overview of all the films, and from Devil's Advocate series for Ota Press, I did a little short. If you don't want to read a big book by me, you can read a short one, which is on Creepshow, which is a wonderful film. And I'm now working on a project about the English horror writer James Herbert.
Nice. Nice. Lynn?
I am on social media, probably too much. You can find me on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook and pretty much everywhere at Fangasm and you can find all of my Will's eyebrows just went up. Yes, Fangasm SPN. I know John Barrowman came up with the name, so you can't totally blame me, but it's stuck. I have a website, fangasmthebook.com, and you can find all of my books, including the one sort of wrapping up the show that has chapters by Jared and Jensen and Misha and most of the other actors. They are all on Amazon, or you can find them on my website.
Okay. Huxley, I don't know if you have a public identity on social media that you want to share, and if not, that's totally okay.
Yeah, no, I'm kind of a social media lurker. I don't have much of a presence on there.
Totally understandable. I'm pretty easy to find at gailzmartin.com, morganbryce.com. All the books are there. I do run the Supernatural TFWNC group here on Facebook, but most of the time I'm here on Continual. So thank you to all of you for spending part of your weekend and having a great conversation. And thanks to all of you for watching and listening. There'll be more Supernatural coming up soon, so we'll see you online.